everybody. The lesson this morning is entitled, Jesus Stands Tall. And we're going to be in the 14th and 15th chapters of the Gospel of Mark. Our objective is to take notice and learn from the display of humility that Jesus gives and his courage in his darkest hour, which provides us with a model for our own difficult times. Our golden text is Mark chapter 14, two verses, verse 60 and verse 61. Where Mark writes, "Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, 'Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?' But Jesus remained silent, and he gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?' This is our golden text. Now, I'm sure you all know that due to the inclement weather, the unsafe road conditions over the last 3 weeks, we missed 3 lessons from our Sunday school curriculum. And only 2 lessons remain, today's and next week's lesson. After that, we begin the new spring quarter. Today's lesson begins in the serene setting of the Garden of Gethsemane, situated in an olive grove. In Eastern terms, they refer to it as a garden, but it's a small grouping of olive trees. And in this place, there is a structure which is used to press the oil. Excuse me, the door, Jack. You didn't get the door shut. Losing heat, so shut the door. This small building is referred to as an oil press. It is the place where they would extract the oil from the olives. And it's somewhat symbolic in that Israel is referred to throughout the scriptures as an olive tree. And Jesus, of course, will be pressed, so to speak, in this place to satisfy the spiritual demands and requirements of the law. Jesus is going to begin the crises of his life here in this serene setting, the Garden of Gethsemane. It will become a place of deep sorrow, a place of betrayal, and at the same time a place of surrender. It is the place of the beginning of the fulfillment of the Father's will. Let's now go to Mark chapter 14, begin with verse 43, reading down through 45, as we see that kiss. Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared, and with him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "When I kisses the man, arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. Now none of this came as a surprise to Jesus. He went into this garden for the purpose of prayer, but more importantly, for the purpose of fulfilling the Father's will. He took with him only 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John. These are the same 3 companions who, at another time before this, witnessed some of the most powerfully, spiritually divine proofs of who Jesus was. One of those was the raising of the daughter of Jairus from the dead. And another was on the Mount of Transfiguration, where he met with the patriarchs of Israel. And it transformed body. Here now, in this place, he would begin the final trial. To get to this location in the garden, they had to pass over the brook Kidron. At this time of year, Kidron would swell to the top of its banks and become virtually a raging torrent. The sound of its waters signaled what lay ahead for them. To them, it might seem like chaos. In retrospect, it was divine order. A struggle ensued. A struggle that would test the man, God, Jesus, and it would test his disciples, testing him in ways he had never yet been tested. Jesus was about to begin the face-off with death. Death's sorrow would fill him. Every man, every woman that's ever lived on this planet has at some point had to face the reality that they will eventually die. But this was the creator of the planet and of the people that live here. And it was only through the experience of becoming a man that he could encounter the prospect to, that is to say, experience the horror of death. As God, he knew what was coming. He had all knowledge. But as man, he had never known the experience of death. Nor had God ever known the experience of death. It's one thing to have the knowledge of the fact of death. It's another thing altogether to have the experience of dealing with the prospect of death and then death itself. Now, it was not this prospect of death that brought the sorrow. It was the prospect of carrying with him the weight of sin into the experience of death. Not his own sin. Jesus had no sin. But he knew that he was going to carry the sin of the world, the weight of sin from every man and woman that lived before him then and ever would live was placed on him. Their sin will be placed on him. And he would taste death carrying this burden of sin that resulted from the fall of the first Adam. Jesus would begin this trial in prayer. Coming into the Garden of Gethsemane, he came there to pray. He would implore his three disciples that accompanied him to watch and pray. Peter, James, and John were given instruction. And then Jesus himself turned to prayer, and they succumbed to irresistible sleep. And when he returned to them and woke them, he didn't scold them or berate them for having not obeyed his instruction, but with compassion and understanding of their humanity, he responded to them. A great deal had passed in that prayer. This is where he pleaded that the cup would pass, but then ultimately surrendered to the will of the Father. He knew the schemes of the betrayal that Satan had put into motion. He was aware at the Last Supper what Judas was about to do. He was not going to be surprised by them. But he knew that his disciples were in a completely different experience. He knew that two of those disciples were under spiritual attack. Judas and Peter. The one, Judas, would give himself over to temptation of greed and jealousy. Peter would abandon him out of fear. Both of these men were being sifted by the enemy like wheat from chaff. But there was a great difference between the two. One had faith and the other did not. When Jesus prayed for Peter, he asked the Father to preserve Peter's faith. He didn't ask the Father to override Peter's will. God has given man the authority and the power to exercise his own will, free of any command or demand for response from God. So Jesus did not ask the Father to compel Peter, but he asked him to preserve his faith. There was no similar prayer for Judas. When you look at the two, it's easy to wonder, why Peter? Why not Judas? But the fact is, there was no faith to build on, no faith to be preserved in Judas. Nothing there, whereas Peter possessed faith. Judas exploited his relationship with Jesus. The fellowship of this band of believers was demonstrated by the intimacy of their relationship. According to Eastern customs, they would, when they encounter one another, they would greet with a kiss. A kiss on the cheek as an expression of friendship. Judas used this very act as a signal to betray his master. His kiss was not so much an act of friendship and recognition, but it was a signal designed to give Jesus up to his enemies. This kiss was the final act of forsaking Jesus on his part. The man Judas in his heart had already abandoned Jesus long before this. That's why Jesus was aware. But with this kiss, he communicated to Jesus his absolute abandonment of Jesus, the man. The abandonment of all he had taught, and the abandonment of the God of Israel. The kiss triggered the events that followed, just like it was planned. It was recognized as a signal. The solitude of the Garden of Gethsemane came to a sudden end. The season of prayer and preparation, which Jesus had engaged in, came to a screeching halt. And the beginning of the passion of the Christ was signaled by this kiss. And that kiss became the prototype of betrayal to this day. Let's go now to Mark 14, verse 46 through 52. Beginning in verse 46, the man, or men, seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Am I leading a rebellion, Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts. You did not arrest me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus, and when they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Priests, including the high priest, were not there in the garden when this arrest took place. Instead, they sent a mob to do their bidding, a mob that included guardians of the temple and some Roman soldiers that were given over to them by Pilate. They came with a warrant to arrest and seize Jesus. There's a great amount of irony in the manner in which these events unfolded, and Jesus points that out. They came in force. They brought with them swords and clubs, and of course, the force of a mob. As though they needed somehow to defeat him in a contingent of rebels. he was prepared from the very beginning to surrender without resistance. On other occasions, he had shown himself capable of escaping mobs, walking through the midst of them, or rendering them powerless with a word. He even demonstrated power over nature itself. So it's comical to think that a mob might defeat him using swords and clubs. Yet, here they were. Peter responded to the threat from the mob with an element of human force of his own, typical of his bombastic nature. He drew a sword, and he struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Jesus reined Peter in immediately, and he healed the man who struck him. And then he points out the irony in verses 53 through 54, where he says, "Do you think I cannot call my Father? And he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way? He had come to this place and to this time for the express purpose of surrendering, not resisting, not fighting back. These were not on his agenda. Submission was his mission, and I don't say that to be trite, but truly, his purpose, his mission was to submit. Only through submission was salvation possible, not his own salvation. He was giving up himself. Rather, the salvation of all those who would believe on him depended on him surrendering, not resisting. Peter had it wrong. To say he had no choice would be absolutely wrong. In fact, choice had already taken place. He made his choice in that garden, on his knees, when he prayed about allowing the cup to pass, and then he surrendered to the will of the Father. This was the moment of choice. Now his arrest was merely a process that he was going through. He warned them with a quotation from Zechariah. In Zechariah 13, verse 7, it says, "Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones." Matthew tells us in chapter 26 and verse 31, "Then Jesus told them, this very night you will all fall away on account of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." So it happened, exactly the way it was predicted in prophecy. His disciples fled as frightened sheep being attacked by wolves. He was not, that is Mark, the author here, was not one of the apostles, but he was present. And in this gospel, he makes a confession about himself and his own flight from the scene. Mark, later on in life, would be an understudy of Paul and Barnabas and would assist them in their missionary work. And then, of course, we know that he became a subordinate of Barnabas alone when he and Paul could not agree on whether Mark should continue with the work. But the point is that Mark became a disciple and was given the honor of writing this gospel under the unction of the Holy Spirit. So he is no insignificant individual in the early church. But this night, he had not started out as part of the group that went to the garden, but he ended up there. It's believed that the mob that came to arrest Jesus first went to the home of Mark's mother, where it's believed that the disciples took their last supper with Jesus on the second floor overlooking valley where the brook Kidron runs. His mother was Mary of the tribe of Levi. And it's also believed that when these Roman soldiers and guards to the temple came to the house, he was awakened by their presence and the noise that they made. And he quickly grabbed a garment to throw over himself and followed them to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he became a witness of the things that took place. But at some point, Mark had it after the arrest of Jesus. Now, they didn't recognize Mark at that moment as a disciple of Jesus, but he did not want that to happen. And so he took flight. They laid hands on him to grab him, and when they did, they got a hold of his cloak, and he ran right out of his coat, naked, down the street. This is the confession that Mark is making here in his gospel of his own conduct that night. But, as Jesus has pointed out, prophetically, and relying on the prophecy of Zechariah to reinforce this truth, it was completely expected by God that Jesus would be abandoned in this hour. And that was also part of the trial, the test, the spiritual trial that Jesus was going through. The worst of it would be Peter's denial, as Jesus told him, before the cock crows 3 times, you will deny me that night. Now let's go to verse 53 of Mark 14. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And there he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. I can use a fire here today. It's cold. Those on the camera who are viewing this on the internet, you're probably sitting in a nice warm house. But the class is sitting in a room that's somewhere around 45 or 48 degrees, keeping us awake. Reading on, verse 55. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Now, going back to the chain of events that night, the first stop after they captured Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane was the palace of Annas. John's Gospel tells us briefly about a hearing in the palace of Annas. Now, Annas was not a high priest yet. A high priest was Caiaphas, his son-in-law. During this interrogation, Jesus was asked about his teachings, and he replied that he had taught openly. Nothing had been done in secret. He either taught in the synagogue or he taught in the temple itself, before assembled crowds. Nothing was clandestine about his teaching. So why do you ask me? He says. Go ask those whom I taught. Well, one of the servants of Annas saw this reply of Jesus as an insult to the priest, Annas. And so he struck Jesus in the face. And Jesus rebuked the man for his blatant violation of the law of Moses. And he challenged them to justify this treatment by identifying which of his teachings offended them. But as we read here in Mark, there was no evidence that they could bring against Jesus, except for some false testimony that conflicted with each other. Now, after this interview at the palace of Annas, Jesus was sent to the palace of Caiaphas, the high priest, where once again he is interrogated. An investigation was conducted. This is where Mark picks up in his gospel. There the elders and the teachers of the law were assembled. Mark tells us that Peter had followed them at a distance and was warming himself by a fire when he witnessed the interrogation. And John also rallied and followed Jesus along with Peter, who was there. Yet Mark does not tell us if he also followed. It seems, though, that he did, based on his familiarity with the events. It's time for me to change the camera settings.